like to welcome everybody. This is the third in a five-part seminar series. We're proud to sponsor this. The series focuses on different aspects of biomedical technology commercialization. And this series is open to all researchers, faculty, staff, and students, because it's important for us to understand from idea to innovation, what does it take? As you may know, RFU has developed many exciting initiatives in biomedical technology and commercialization with the goal of accelerating the discovery and development of new diagnostics, biomarkers, therapeutics, et cetera, to improve quality of patients' lives. Among these new initiatives, prominently is our new Innovation and Research Park and Helix 51 Incubator, the only ones of their kind in Lake County, Illinois, home to 122 bioscience companies and 33,000 bioscience jobs. This third seminar will focus on the impact of the FDA on product development. It is never too early to formulate a regulatory strategy. It will be presented by Robin Geller and Edwin Moore. There's been a lot of interest in intellectual property and startup company formation throughout the university. These seminars will provide information on issues such as drug development process, legal and regulatory information, and funding. Each seminar will focus on different aspects of innovation, protection, company formation, and financing, and will be presented by industry experts. The programs are designed to give a robust sense of what it takes to create a startup company and or create an innovative technology, specifically in the life sciences, but with applicability in other disciplines. If you have further questions on biomedical innovation process, please feel free to reach out to either Dr. Connie Cleary, our Director of Innovation and Industry Partnerships, or Michael Rosen, our Managing Director of the Innovation and Research Park and Helix 51 Incubator, or Dora Espinoza, our Associate VP for Sponsored Research and Technology Transfer. We're glad you're able to share this hour with us and hope it is a beneficial use of your time. And with that, I turn the microphone back over to Dr. Connie Cleary, our Director of Innovation and Industry Partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaplan. That was a warm welcome. I'd like to take this opportunity now to introduce our speakers from BioPhia, Ed Moore and Robin Geller.
Great, thank you so much, Connie. And Michael, thank you also, and Dr. Kaplan for that warm welcome and introduction. We're going to talk about the impact of FDA on product development. We want to talk about specifically about three areas of the FDA, but FDA covers, as you may be aware, a large number of products that they regulate, both drugs, biologics, medical devices, foods, and the other list, cosmetics. The list that you see here are fairly extensive, but we're really going to focus today on human drugs, biologics, and on medical devices. And if you think back, the FDA hasn't really been around that long. And as a matter of fact, there's drug companies that have been around longer than the FDA. A company that many of us are familiar with, Abbott Laboratories, was started by Dr. Wallace Abbott. And if you think about back then, the physicians were actually rolling their own pills. They were compounding pill and chemicals and forming pills, and they would then use those in their own practice. Well, Dr. Abbott saw that there was a need for more than that, and so he had set up a pharmacy, and he started making and distributing pills for other physicians up and down the North Shore of by Chicago for up and down the North Shore of Lake Michigan, and formed the Abbott Alkaloid company back then. But the FDA actually came along a little bit later and started with in 1902 the Biological Controls Act, but it really wasn't until 1938 that the FDA, an act was passed by Congress, and largely due to the sulfa drugs and the variability and the poor quality of the sulfa drugs that were being used, and the FDA and Congress saw a need to regulate those and to perhaps provide better controls, better qualities of drugs that were available. So in 1938, the Food and Drug and Cosmetics Act was passed, and that's when the FDA really began. And a number of other things happened along the way, bills that were passed by Congress But notice that this is all law. So everything that the FDA does is driven by law. It's the FDA's responsibility to implement these laws into practice and to provide the industry with that basis for product approvals. The next significant timeline that I really wanted to mention was when medical devices came about in 1976. So up until 1976, medical devices weren't regulated, but because of developments that were occurring and the types of devices that were becoming, the technologies that were being developed, the FDA Congress created the Medical Device Amendment, and FDA then created the agency that regulated those medical devices, put all of those laws into practice that could be implemented. And so the timeline goes out to currently biosimilars being the most recent law that was passed by Congress, and now the FDA implementing those laws into practice and regulating those products. And Robin will talk a little bit later about the biologics and the biosimilars in particular. So these three areas are covered by three different agencies. The biologics by CBER, the pharmaceuticals by CDER, and the medical devices by CDRH. So I'm going to talk about the devices, and then Robin's going to come back and talk about the pharmaceuticals and biologics. So what is a medical device? Well, it's an implement. So it's a device, and it can take many different forms. It's used for diagnosing diseases, and that can either be cures or treatments or mitigations of any sort. It could be both on humans and on other animals, and still be regulated by CDRH. And it also is a non-chemical action. So that's because all of chemical actions are regulated as pharmaceuticals or as biologics. If you go to the CDRH website, you'll find a number of really phenomenal resources that help to understand what those regulations are and guidances that are available and discuss specific policies. But there's also this collection of databases that are extremely useful. And I'm going to come back to those in a little bit and show why those are important. You know, these are fantastic resources that are available. But what are medical devices? Well, they're divided up into classifications. So class 1 devices are the most simple devices, Band-Aids, rubber gloves. Those are all examples of devices that are regulated by the FDA. But as a class 1 device, there isn't an approval process, there's a registration process, and there's an annual reporting of any changes or problems that occur with those devices, but they aren't really they don't go through an approval process for these very simple devices. Class 2 devices, on the other hand, are approved. Class 2 devices are devices that are equivalent to an existing device. And so the approval process is a simpler process because what you're basing it on the safety and the efficacy of a predicate device. And there's the approval process called a 510K merely demonstrates that you meet all of those safety and efficacy requirements, and that the product is equivalent through the clinical trials that are conducted, that it's equivalent to that predicate device. It may be that your device is better than what's out there, but all you're claiming and all the approval is that you are equivalent to the previous device. There is a little bit of there's a newer version that's called a de novo application, where medical devices maybe that need to be demonstrated that they are safe and efficacious, that the risk level is equivalent to the predicate device, And the FDA may require that you go through a de novo approval process, which is a little bit more sophisticated than a simple 510K, but requires a little bit more clinical justification or clinical demonstration of safety and efficacy. And the most difficult is the class 3 devices. And these are new, novel, never before seen applications of devices. And you can see some examples of products that had to go through a class 3 approval process down below. And there's more examples that you can see on the website. The approval process is called a pre-market approval, a PMA, and it requires that you do a clinical trial, which through the investigational device exemption, which the IDE, which is part of this process, and that all is to demonstrate the safety and the efficacy of this new device. So that's a class 3 approval. And whereas a 510K approval is by law is required within 90 days of application. And the FDA can stop that if there's questions, and that stop the clock if there's questions, but it's still a 90-day approval for a class 2 device. But for a class 3 device, it can take much longer, maybe up to 9 months for the approval process, because the FDA has so much more information that they've requested and so much more information to go through to demonstrate that safety and efficacy of the device. So how do you figure out what the classification is? Well, is it a class 1? Is it a class 2? Is it a class 3? You've got a new technology. You've got a great idea of how this might be applied. What classification is it? And obviously that'll be very impactful for your development process and the amount of money that's going to be needed to develop it. So getting the classification right is really important. And so the classification depends upon the intended use and the indications for use, first of all. Second of all, it depends upon the risk level of the device. And sometimes even if it's a class 2 device, as I said, the FDA may say, this is a little bit riskier. You're going to need to go through a de novo application for this, a little bit more data that's needed by the FDA in order to judge its safety and efficacy. Or it may be a class 3 and you know that it doesn't exist and needs to go through that more extensive approval process. And so the classification then, as you see here, as we talked about, requires different levels of demonstration and of safety and efficacy for approval. Just briefly, there is on the CDRH website this database of product classification that can help you figure out whether the type of device, the classification of device is a class 1, class 2, or class 3. And so the FDA provides a search tool to help you. And as I say, the process of developing depends the amount of time that it takes. It depends upon the classification. So, but the process for developing a medical device is the same, and the FDA expects the same level of quality that you put into the product and monitoring of quality. So quality controls and audits and so on are still done regardless of whether it's a class 1, class 2, or class 3 device. The FDA is going to look for that same measure of demonstrating safety continuously for the product and looking for also improvements in the product. And so the process is the same. It's just whether the extent to which you have to demonstrate the product's attributes. So as I said before, 510K, pre-market approval, safety and efficacy, and then there is also a database where you can look up predicate devices. That's obviously very important if you have a class 2 device for a 510K application, is to know what previous products, competitive products, have been approved that are like the one that you're describing. And FDA provides a handy database that allows you to search those previously approved predicate devices for your comparison. And the PMA, as I said, takes a little bit more effort. It requires going through extensive demonstration of safety and efficacy, both in the testing of the device that you're going to do in your hands, as well as the clinical trials that you're going to do for that product to get pre-market approval for the device. One thing that I wanted to point out that the FDA requires for all medical devices is human factors engineering. And you have to, and there's a number of guidances, I'm not going to go through all of these, but anyway, that are out on the FDA website that talk about human factors engineering. It's a critical aspect of devices today that you demonstrate that the users who are going to use this can perform the procedures that the device requires. And so human factors engineering is a big part of that, incorporating that into your clinical trials as well, and providing that data to the FDA. And some of the guidances show how to incorporate human factors data into the approval process. Development of the products requires, you understand what the materials are that are going to be used, and then what the regulatory strategy is. And what we recommend is that this is a very complex process, and it's recommend that you very early on in the process get the help from a regulatory consultant, somebody who's been down this road before, somebody who has maybe been part of the FDA as a regulatory and now as a regulatory consultant. The other thing is to seek the FDA's input early in the process. You can go to the FDA during, once you have a prototype in hand and you understand what the concept is, and you can lay out what you think the regulatory approach needs to be, and you can seek the FDA's advice before you get to the point of actually a submission, so that you can do all of the proper studies that are needed and build that into your development plans. So it's really important to seek the FDA's advice early in through the mechanisms that the FDA has provided. And just so everybody knows, that's going to the FDA with a proposal. FDA expects that you will have a proposed strategy that you lay out for your particular prototype concept. If you just simply go and say, what do you think? They'll tell you, we're not your consultant. Go back and come back when you have a better idea of a proposal. The other thing I want to make everybody aware of is that there is what's called a humanitarian use device. So what this is equivalent to the orphan drug. And so it's a quick approval. It's an abbreviated process that the FDA expects for the giving, but then giving this status of humanitarian use. And so that's an important thing to understand as well. Combination products. So oftentimes we need to have a therapeutic drug with a device in order to deliver the drug, or it may be two different devices that are used together in combination, but the FDA provides for approval of combination products, and there is an office of combination products that helps figure out which of the agencies needs to be involved in the approval process, and then they will engage those agencies, and they'll point out who is going to be the primary agency that will drive this, but the requirements of both agencies need to be met for the approval of a combination product. And that provides a nice transition for me to hand it off to Robin to talk about the therapeutic drugs and biologics.
All right, thanks, Ed. We'll start with the drug approval process. I think while probably many more devices than drugs are approved in any given year, the drug approval process is the one that gets the most attention. a rough outline of the process. It's very similar in many ways to what Ed's already shown you for the device approval process. There's a preclinical development. There's the initial design and development stage that's at the bench. Then there's preclinical research and development, the clinical trials resulting in a submission to the FDA for their review, and then hopefully approval. But then regulation doesn't stop at that point. Even during the manufacturing and life cycle of drug products, there is FDA oversight and continuous review. The boxes underneath show the various points that things are submitted. And then at the bottom are various FDA meetings that one has at different stages of development. And we'll come back to that at a later slide. The new drug application is really the format for submitting to FDA. And this is the vehicle through which a formal submission is made asking for approval and marketing in the US. And it includes all of the preclinical animal data as well as the clinical data and analysis of that data. And FDA oftentimes does their own analysis based on the raw data. So that's part of the reason why this process, even once a submission is made, can take a good deal of time. So what's the basis for an approval? Well, it's actually threefold. The first is, and most important, is that the drug be both safe and effective. In the various laws that were passed that Ed talked about earlier in the history slide, the FDA came to a paradigm that drugs in the US need to be both safe and effective. But beyond that, they've also started to ask what the risk-benefit ratio of the drug is, and the benefits of a drug have to outweigh the risks for it to be approved. Given that you meet all of those bars, the next is that the labeling is appropriate for the drug and how it's used, and that's monitored and approved separately and can be obviously modified as the drug matures in the marketplace. And then finally, FDA looks at the methods of manufacture and the controls on that manufacturing to ensure that the highest levels of quality are maintained throughout the manufacturing process, so as to preserve the drug's identity, strength, quality, and purity. This is a novel drug product is approved, but that's usually limited to a period of time based on patent protection, at which point, based on, again, law passed by the US Congress, in the US, we can have generic drugs introduced. And the next slide talks about the generic drug application process. This is called an ANDA, or abbreviated new drug application. And again, it's the full submission, it's the full package of all data for review, but it's called abbreviated because generally they are not required to include preclinical and clinical data that are necessary to establish safety and effectiveness. That's a given based on the initial new drug application for the innovator product. The point of the generic application is a scientific demonstration that the product performs in the same manner as the innovator drug, usually done by showing bioequivalence. The generic has to deliver the same amount of active ingredient into a patient's bloodstream in the same amount of time as the innovator drug does. Now, that's very limited then. That's the same amount of drug for the same period of time, and usually for the same indication. So in the last few years, probably dozen years, obviously people have come up with new uses for drugs that are generic even. And the question is how to go through the approval process. Is it a new drug? Is it a generic drug? So FDA has come up with a third pathway. The 505(b)(2) application is a new drug application that contains full reports of investigations of safety and effectiveness, but some of that data may have come from other companies or other studies or studies in the literature. It's based on what's already known about the product and extends in some direction the application of that drug. And in some cases, it can even use the agency's own analysis for that. And the next couple of slides talk about the types of things that can be used for 505(b)(2). So the obvious one is a change in dosage form or strength. But there's also substitution of active ingredients in combination products. There's changes in formulation, changes in dosing regimen. There are new molecular entities such as prodrug or active metabolites, such that the active ingredient at the end of the day is the same, but getting there in the body may be a little different. So the emphasis there is not on establishing the safety and effectiveness of the final drug, but of understanding the safety and effectiveness of that prodrug to drug conversion. New combination products in which the combination components have been approved separately. You can also go for new indications because you can build it on the basis of what's already known about the drug and then extend it to a new indication. You can do prescription to over-the-counter switches, over-the-counter monographs, and inclusion of some naturally derived or recombinant active ingredients. And also where the bioequivalence is a little bit different, but the action and the end result of the drug are the same. So you can see this casts a very wide net across what you can do with a drug. And that's really been the beauty of the 505(b)(2) process. It doesn't necessarily involve new clinical studies, but it oftentimes does, because you have to bridge to the FDA satisfaction the differences between the approved product that you're basing your application on and the indications and process that you've used for your drug. So the studies that are used for that are referred to as bridging studies and are generally more abbreviated and shorter than a full clinical trial plan would be. So that's the overview of drug approvals. Then there's biologics, which is as Ed said, the newest entry into the approved products realm. And so the next slide shows the list of what could be considered a biologic. And as you can see, it's a huge list. And actually what's not even on here is there are devices that are approved by CBER as devices for biologics use. So CBER really covers a lot of territory, but it includes proteins, nucleic acids, cells and tissues, and within all of those groups, vaccines play a prominent role in biologics. The next slide talks about the approval process itself, which is called the Biological License Application, or BLA. And basically it's pretty much analogous to the NDA, the new drug application, in that it's the vehicle through which FDA assesses all of the data for a product. It includes all of the animal and human data and analyses of those data, as well as how the drug behaves in the body and how it is manufactured. The BLA combines everything into one application. And again, the goals are to show the drug is safe and effective, that the labeling is appropriate, and that the methods used and that the benefits of the drug outweigh the risks. And then finally, that the manufacturing and controls used to maintain the product quality are adequate to ensure the product's safety, stability, identity, quality, and purity. And this is shown in a diagram on the next slide, which again is identical to the one I showed you earlier for the new drug application process. So it's really all the same steps: the preclinical development, clinical trials, the BLA process, and then post-approval monitoring. This again is equivalent to the new drug application process. Well, what about once you have an innovator? What's the next biologic of the same type? How is that approved? Well, initially there wasn't a mechanism. It was done as a new BLA, which is quite a burdensome process involving clinical studies and everything else. But the Congress and then FDA have put together a plan called biosimilars and interchangeable products. A biosimilar is a biologic product that is highly similar to and has no clinically meaningful differences from an existing FDA-approved reference product. So it's sort of a generic, but not exactly, because unlike drugs, which are manufactured by chemical synthesis, these are made in bioreactor systems. So there's always going to be small differences in glycosylation, differences in maybe the particular peptides that the final product has, if there are some that are not biologically active. And so they're similar, but they're not identical. And as such, it's necessary to show that they have the same biological effect, even though there may be minor manufacturing differences, which are then called out in the application. An interchangeable product is an even smaller category, and these are biosimilars that are expected to produce the same clinical result as the reference product in any given patient, but that have such low risk in terms of switching products that they can be used interchangeably with the innovator product. And really what the key here is the concern with the biologics is an immune response, because you're now dealing with bioactive proteins. And in this case, what they're saying is that you can use them interchangeably without risk of any kind of an immune response or other untoward safety effect of switching between. So this actually comes closer to the idea of a generic, but they're still considered different because their manufacturing processes are not identical. The goal of biosimilars is to show that they are equivalent to the innovator product. And you don't necessarily need clinical trials for that. It's largely done through analytic studies that demonstrate that the product is highly similar to the reference product. There are animal studies that are done to show that there's no difference in toxicity and immunogenicity. And there may be clinical studies to demonstrate safety, purity, and potency in one or more of the indications for which the reference drug is approved. Typically, these include immunogenicity, pharmacokinetics, and pharmacodynamics study. What is valuable about the biosimilar approval is if the innovator product is approved for multiple uses and you're approved as a biosimilar, you are automatically approved for all of those same uses, even if your comparator studies only focused on a single indication. So it gives you the potential to have a broader approval than you would get ordinarily. You get the full label of the innovator product. Obviously, this is a lengthy process involving clinical studies and extensive review by FDA. So starting actually with the development of the AIDS drugs in the 90s, there's been a movement in late 80s, 90s, there's been a movement to accelerate the FDA review process. And FDA has come up with a number of different pathways to do this. There's a standard process that takes about 10 months. It can be longer depending on what FDA finds. So the first one that was developed, and this one was developed initially for the AIDS products, is the fast track review. And this is a process that's designed to facilitate the development and expedite the review of drugs to create serious conditions and fill unmet clinical needs. And this has been used extensively. There's I think there's over 250 drugs now that have been approved through the fast track or one of these other processes. There's breakthrough therapy, which is a similar process for new platforms and new innovative therapeutics. There is an accelerated approval where rather than having to show full efficacy, you can base efficacy on surrogate markers with the expectation that you will complete full clinical trials for efficacy after the initial approval as an accelerated approval in order to get a full approval. And then there's a priority review in which FDA commits to try to review the drug within 6 months, as opposed to the average of 10. these have all been used for the last couple decades with mixed results. And in fact, there was an article just in this morning's New York Times about this fast track designations and expedited review processes, and that they're coming under scrutiny both by the FDA and by Congress, because these drugs often come with commitments to do additional studies after the expedited approval, and those are not getting done in a timely manner, is sort of the gist of the article, an interesting one to read. The next slide talks about orphan drug designation. Ed talked about the humanitarian use exemption in devices. The orphan drug designation is the drug version of this. It applies to both drugs and biologics. Conditions affecting fewer than 200,000 persons in the United States, or drugs that will not be profitable within 7 years following approval based on criteria set by the FDA. There are also some economic benefits. There are tax credits. There are waivers of user fees, and there is marketing exclusivity. The orphan drug status can be requested at any time during the drug development process, including during an IND. And it has been used where in the course of doing clinical trials, you find that the benefit of a drug is really to a very small subset of the population that you thought would benefit from the drug. And this would allow you to continue and do those definitive studies to benefit that what is now perceived as a smaller population. The next slide talks about the last special use, and that is one we've all heard about a lot with COVID, and that's the emergency use authorization. This is a mechanism that facilitates the availability and use of medical countermeasures, including vaccines, during public health emergencies. And it is totally, completely linked to a public health emergency. It applies to drugs, devices, biologics, diagnostics. It basically acts across all areas of FDA. And under an emergency use authorization, the FDA may allow the use of these products or of products already approved, but for an indication outside of their approval, in an emergency to diagnose, treat, or prevent a serious or life-threatening disease or conditions. This approval, however, is limited to the duration of that emergency. So once the emergency declaration is terminated, and they do need to be formally terminated, any emergency use authorization issued under that declaration will no longer be in effect. And the expectation is that even under the emergency use authorizations, that the companies will continue to work towards submitting all of the data needed for a full approval, as we've all seen with, most notably with the pandemic vaccines during COVID. So the next couple of slides, I wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking about regulatory planning. And really that's the process by which a company, especially a startup company with new products, starts thinking about and building the regulatory process into all of their activities, even in the early phases. So the next slide talks about the two strategies. And the first is regulatory strategy. And that's really a document that aligns the regulatory activities to bring a product to market with the business strategy for the product, because you need the two to be aligned. You need to have the plans for how what you're going to market the product for, how you're going to market it, aligned with what regulations will permit in any given jurisdiction. But that's really a very high level document. The nuts and bolts of what the regulatory activities are summarized in a document called a regulatory plan, which describes the specific steps and actions that are required to meet the regulatory challenges. And there are a number of elements that can be included in a regulatory plan, and these can include any country-specific regulatory requirements, the specific regulations, guidances, and laws that are and standards that are going to be used to measure the product both in its development and by the regulatory body. In the case of devices, the predicate device and what comparisons you're going to do to show equivalence. You want to start building a matrix of claims with the supporting data for each of those claims. The proposed labeling, which is obviously going to change as the product development develops, but you want to start getting that information captured. All of the preclinical and clinical studies, literature references, any consideration of alternative pathways for approval, and information and/or commitments from any pre-submission meetings with the authorities, and also just questions that you would want to work into any request for a meeting with the regulatory authorities. Which brings us to the next topic, which is communicating with the FDA. As Ed said earlier, communicating early and often is a good plan. And the boxes at the bottom of this slide, which is the same one I've shown before, are really the points during drug and device development that you can that are sort of benchmarks for meeting with the FDA. The first one, the Interact meeting, is the newest one, and we can talk about that on the next slide. Initial targeted engagement for regulatory advice on CBER products, Interact, a whole mouthful of a name, is really a meeting that's brand new. It's only been in existence for a couple of years. There's no guidance. There's only a FDA SOP governing it. And it was developed out of the need for discussions around the initial preclinical safety and toxicity meetings with FDA, and giving companies an opportunity to come and talk to FDA so that they don't spend time and money pursuing testing plans that don't meet FDA's expectations. And in the course of planning these meetings, the companies are free to talk about other topics, again, as Ed pointed out, in terms of specific proposals and specific questions about how to meet FDA's expectations, not just FDA's blessing. That's not what they do. They will give you feedback on your plans. They won't give you a blessing. There's also a biosimilar initial advisory meeting, which is designed to help companies who are thinking about developing biosimilars, and an ANDA pre-submission meeting to make sure that your development plans are appropriate. For devices, there is a relatively new guidance out called the Q-Submission program, which involves pre-submission meetings called pre-subs with FDA, where again, you can go and ask specific questions about your development plan. You can have meetings on specific submission issue requests and study risk determination and general informational meetings. These are all the ones that are proposed in this guidance for device development.
Great, thanks very much. So we've talked all about the FDA and gone over it at probably about the 60,000 foot level a discussion of the FDA and requirements, because we wanted to give you a total perspective on how to deal with the many different medical products that you're dealing with. But FDA isn't alone in regulating these products. There are agencies and authorities that are in other parts of the world, different regions that regulate those products. And you really need to understand, if you're going to market in those areas, what those requirements are to meet them, because they are different than the FDA's requirements. So because they have different laws and so different implementations. And then just to wrap up, a little bit of an advertisement. So BioPhia is we have experts, people who have been part of companies that, like Robin and I, that spent our career developing medical products, and everybody within BioPhia has a different area of focus and different expertise that we bring to this. So if there's anything that we can do to help you in your product development, we're more than happy to do so. Thank you very much, everybody. We definitely enjoyed the opportunity to present, and thank you. Look forward to working with all of you.